Hi everyone, this is Dr. Bret Stetka from Medscape. I'm the editorial director of Medscape Psychiatry and Neurology. I hope everyone can hear me. Um, Very excited about today's program. This is kind of a new format for us on Instagram Live. We're going to be doing what you might call a book club. So we have Dr. Uma Naidoo today, who's a nutritional psychiatrist from Harvard, who knows all things nutrition and the brain and mental health. She will be joining us momentarily. So we each have new books out in the past few months about the brain. I have a book called A History of the Human Brain, from the sea sponge to CRISPR, how I almost forgot how our brain evolved. And Uma has a great new best-selling book called This Is Your Brain on Food, which is your guide to all things brain health, how to keep your brain healthy through diet. And it's really just a trove of information. Let me see if Uma is here. Okay. I'll try to get her on here. Give her 1 second while people join. Hi, Dr. Naidoo, how are you?
I'm great, Bret. How are you?
I'm good. Sorry, we were a little late there. A couple of technical difficulties, but we should be good.
That's awesome.
Well, I was just giving a little introduction. As I mentioned when people were joining, we each have new books out about the brain. Mine's
yes, absolutely.
So mine's A History of the Human Brain, and
I love your book. Yes, and I've been enjoying it. And thank you. I think this is such a cool format. So thanks for doing that.
Oh, of course, I'm glad you're here, and thanks for coming. This is kind of new for Medscape, sort of a book club where we kind of discuss the overlap between our books. Yeah. Mine is about the evolution and the anthropology behind how our brain got here, with plenty of nutrition and diet background, and yours is this trove of information on what we need to be eating to preserve our brain health and our mental health, and it's fascinating and incredibly useful and practical stuff. So yeah, hopefully we can just have a discussion about where our kind of areas overlap. And
absolutely,
I thought you could talk. Oh, sorry, what's that?
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say if you want to dive right in, maybe you could just give us a synopsis of what is nutritional psychiatry in the first place, and how did you get involved in this field?
Absolutely. It may be a little bit of a long-winding answer, but it's sort of like sometimes you think about how things happen, and you realize it had many different layers to it. But most importantly, I was able to have the opportunity to bring my interest forward in nutrition, mental health, and culinary arts unexpectedly, because I'd studied these three areas totally separately and really just followed my love for food, interest in psychiatry and medicine, and then also the culinary arts. Training as a professional chef was one of the best experiences of my life, and I think that I didn't expect to be able to integrate it in the work that I do. But in reality, nutritional psychiatry is a more nascent field, and it's certainly work that I've been doing since residency, but not calling it that. I first became interested in nutrition and mental health. Well, I think it stems from my childhood, but doesn't everything. I sort of grew up in a large Indian family, lots of food, love cooking, recipes, talk about medicine, talk about Ayurvedic principles, but it really did stem from there. And I think that when I started to learn about psychiatric medications, I felt that there needed to be more tools in the toolkit. And when I had the opportunity to study more on all of this, I really felt that beginning a clinical service that helped individuals with this additional tool, being nutritional work and nutritional strategies in nutritional psychiatry, would be helpful. So nutritional psychiatry is really the use of healthy whole foods and nutrients to improve our mental fitness. And that's what my book is about. So I was excited that I could do that.
That's great. That's fascinating. And how did you manage to squeeze in culinary training during your medical training?
So I did it. I actually did a culinary training when I was a junior attending, and part of it was I just probably for several years there worked more hours than were necessary, but it was moving my schedule around, working with my colleagues around, making sure my work was covered when I wasn't physically present and away at school. And I think that it was driven by pure passion, because when I think back to how did I have the energy, the hours, the time to study, I think that it has a lot to do with really loving something that you want to do. I mean, you just wrote an amazing book, Bret. You know that that's an act of love right there, because
For
it
sure.
takes so much out of your life, right?
It does, and I think that's where we overlap, is we just went through this experience of writing a book. And in my past life, as I was becoming a health journalist, not
Yes.
practicing medicine, going into research, and somehow becoming this health journalist that I am, I developed a side career in food journalism and became really interested in
I
in all of this, all the nutrition and just the
I
ingredients.
was
And
reading about that, and I was going to ask you about that. Firstly, your career is fascinating, because I think that so many of us in medicine are writers, but you have really brought it forward and taken it seriously. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you came to write this amazing book, as well. Just sort of your journey, and it's such an interesting topic, and not been written about from that perspective. So I would love to know that too.
Sure. Just a little background. I went to UVA med school, was planning on becoming a neurologist, ended up in a few research labs and loved the science behind it. So rather than entering residency match, I did a research postdoc up here in New York at Mount Sinai in a biological psychiatry lab, studying the effects of resveratrol in the mouse brain.
Oh,
Um,
awesome.
and I think
You were getting all those little mice drunk. That's what you were doing, Brett.
I was, and I'm convinced that the PI in the lab was Italian and loved wine, so I think he was just trying to justify his wine habit. But but I ended up publishing 3 or 4 papers in that first year and loved sort of melding the creative aspect of science, writing about it, while also keeping up to date on it. And I needed money, so I got a job at WebMD and Medscape, thinking it would be temporary, and just loved writing about medicine. It's been
Yeah.
14 years now.
Wow.
So yeah, and then I started I started freelancing for NPR and Scientific American, did dabbled
Hmm.
with this food writing thing on the side for various
Hmm.
New York magazines. And yeah, I got approached by an agent maybe 3 years ago who'd read my Medscape work in
Hmm.
Scientific American and said, "Do you have an idea for a book?" And I said, "No, I don't." um, but I poked around, and there hadn't really been a layman's book about where our brain came from and what were the
Yeah.
evolutionary forces that really drove it. And in part, I was inspired by our mutual colleague, Drew Ramsey, who I
Oh,
know you
yeah.
know well.
Of course.
I saw him speak at the APA meeting.
Right.
He gave this presentation with Emily Deans on the best foods for the brain.
That's right.
Uh,
That was years ago. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was were you there? It was packed. It was
No, I wasn't there that year, but I heard all about it from him and from others. It sounded like it was amazing.
it was so hard to get in. There were hundreds of people trying to cram in, and he got into some of the evolutionary reasons why, say,
Hmm.
oysters are good for us. And he was handing out
Yeah.
oysters at eight in the morning to psychiatrists, which was weird, but it made an impression. And so when I pitched it, I really wanted diet to be part of this book, because I think it's
This
a
book,
huge
great.
integral part of the human saga and the human story.
Yeah. How did you so when you did complete writing the book, can you share with us sort of the elements around diet that were most fascinating to you?
Sure, and then I'll throw that back to you for your input as a nutrition expert. There's actually a big divide among biologists on this.
Mm.
There's the camp really led by Michael Crawford in England, who in the 70s did some of the groundbreaking omega-3 research,
Hmm.
showing that marine-born omega-3s are incorporated into rat muscle tissue and rat brain tissue much more quickly and efficiently than plant-sourced
Yeah.
omega-3s.
Hmm.
And so he really was one of the scientists that, is the reason why omega-3s are at all of the, every CVS on the corner. And so he's convinced that the animal brain evolved at sea 500 or 600 million years ago, so it makes sense
Hmm.
that marine nutrients are important for our brain
Important.
function. Yeah, so
Mm.
omega-3s, iodine, things like that.
Hmm.
And I tend to agree. I mean, it would just make sense because our brain, as you know, is what, 60% fat, and
Yeah.
omega-3s are incredibly healthy for the brain. And then there's the camp in anthropology, which I also agree with, which as we were evolving, say 2 million years ago, as Homo erectus was evolving, our ancestor, it was more about survival. We just needed calories wherever we could get them. So we started hunting. We get this incredibly rich, nutrient-rich, meat, basically. And I've heard this from many vegetarian scientists that meat was really critical to our evolution. And that's when we started eating meat reliably, our brains exploded in size, which was probably just reliable calories, nothing specific to meat itself. But then certain populations on the African coast clearly learned how to shuck shellfish and track tides and started eating marine nutrients over the last million years. Which, and I think it was really a matter of our omnivorism was so important back then. When we only lived to be 35, the nutrients themselves weren't as important. It was, we just need to survive on whatever we can.
To survive.
And humans are one of the most omnivorous species on Earth. We can eat grass, fruits, vegetables, meat, seafood, and most species can't do that. So I think the omnivorism was a big part of our history. And now I'd like to throw it back to you, because now that we live so much longer, I think the nutrients that you write about so wonderfully are much more important to the aging brain, right? I mean, to longevity.
Yes, to longevity as well as everything else. I think for me, so that is fascinating. I love hearing that because, now, like you say, every corner store has omega-3s, and it's great to know scientifically where some of this information was brought forward. For my book, I really felt that the missing gap in nutritional psychiatry was that there hasn't been a book that looked at the different mental health conditions. And if it's anything that COVID has taught us, it is that, not only is our metabolic health important and the existence of pre-existing conditions, but that many more people are suffering with mental health issues that have come forward or that have emerged because of the immense stress that the pandemic placed on us. And this is where food becomes a really easy task, a very easy thing that any one of us can do to help. The premise of the book was based on reviewing everything and based on all of my clinical work, the clinical body of evidence, the clinical science, and then the research behind the different conditions. Because when you practice in mental health, you realize it's so many conditions that you're dealing with. For example, insomnia, which people are now calling coronasomnia, anxiety, depression, OCD symptoms of trauma, problems with use of substances during the pandemic. Everything has emerged. So it's not as though we can only look at one angle anymore. So in my book, I decided to look at the different conditions and help guide people as to where the research lay around the foods that, and omega-3s actually fall in several categories, were helpful for your brain health, or those that were harmful, because I think it's equally important for people to know where the hidden things are that may be actually impacting their mental health. So much is said about added and refined sugars and all sorts of different foods, but people don't associate it with mental health. They think that it's related to type 2 diabetes, and it is, weight gain, and it is, but it's also related to impacting your mental health. That's where I felt that my book needed to help guide people as really a compendium to the different conditions and what you can do. So I have lists, foods you can embrace and foods to avoid in every chapter, and then recipes at the end. And I hope it's helpful to people during the pandemic, because we certainly need something to sort of stave off the different emotions that this has caused.
Sure, and I'll show your book once again. This is Your Brain on Food.
We should do it mutually.
You can dig into all.
I love your cover, by the way. I love the colors. I really do. And I love the history of the human brain from the sea sponge to CRISPR, which I love. So. That's a really cool title too.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a psychedelic version of a brain scan that someone photoshopped at my publisher.
Photoshop, right? Absolutely. When you look at it, you realize the structure.
No, that's interesting. I think that's where our books definitely overlap. And I'm curious, knowing how important diet is and specific nutrients are, how do you incorporate nutritional psychiatry into patient care? I mean, I assume it's not a first line treatment. This is in conjunction with traditional therapies.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
nutritional psychiatry, certainly the way that I practice it always may include the use of medications. And there
Mm-hmm.
may be a very small number of individuals who are functioning, who are otherwise coping well, but have one set of symptoms that they're trying to work on. One example is a very high functioning executive that I treated a few years ago who came in with severe panic. But she was otherwise functioning at work, and was willing and able to tolerate dietary changes, which she jumped
Mm-hmm.
in to immediately upon working with me. So we avoided medications in that situation. But medications are a very life-saving part of mental health. So I don't exclude them, but I include. I have a sort of privileged position in my clinic of really more running it like a concierge service, so I can focus entirely on the nutritional psychiatry evaluation. So I work often in conjunction with other prescribing doctors to guide the process so that we can focus on the nutritional strategies.
Right. And from an evolutionary point of view, this is something that I'm fascinated by is why through natural selection have conditions like anxiety and depression been conserved? Why you think
Yeah.
that someone suffering from such a severe condition, that it wouldn't have lasted, it would have been selected against. But I think it's
Hmm.
important to point out that within constraints, having a little anxiety is a survival strategy,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah,
I mean, you want to be a
exactly.
little fearful to get away from that lion on the plains,
That's
and
right.
depression is associated with empathy and
Hmm.
emotional, being very humanistic and emotional. But then when
Hmm.
these traits get too extreme, then we run into trouble in the modern world.
Absolutely. Well, I like what you said, Brett, because anxiety is a normal is also part of life, and the
Right.
anxiety that we would have had before our board exams, or those tests that we took, that was necessary to keep us up and drinking coffee or whatever you did to keep awake to get your studying done and then go and perform in your test. But when
Mm.
it flips over into being so jazzed that you can't study, or because I know this is a medical audience, or so sort of hyped up that you actually can't function. I have patients who are feeling so anxious at home that they can't get onto their Zoom meeting. So that becomes, that clinical fine line of where treatment of some form is needed. And sometimes it's a combination of therapy, medications, and nutritional interventions. And sometimes it's other things, other lifestyle measures as well, which I'm a
Hmm.
big believer in. But it's similar to inflammation, which is now being seen as such a driver of conditions in mental health. And inflammation is also, you fall and you scab your, you scuff your knee, and you have to recover from that, and you develop a scab, and that's also inflammation involved. But it's
Mm.
inflammation in the sort of in the body that again flips over into this more chronic, sustained version is what we need to fend off. And one of the ways to do that is with food.
Hmm.
So I think it's important to know the context of these conditions as well.
For sure, and that brings up another point tying our books together. So I got into the fact that back a million or 2 years ago, or even longer, in our monkey cousins 7, 8, 10 million years ago, we evolved a third cone in our eye to see three arrays of colors on the spectrum, so we could really go after bright fruits, and then
Right.
and so if we see a source of sugar in nature, we want it because that's reliable calories once again.
Calories. Yeah.
And that's so that's why we have this sweet tooth, and we want fatty meats because once again they
Yeah.
keep us alive. But now we're
Right.
stuck with living so long that we still want that hamburger, and we still want that
Right.
sugar and that candy. So how do you deal with that in your practice?
I think that part of one of the things I talk to people about is we can't necessarily change the food system that we face. So those conditions that drive us toward getting that sugary treat, which I often will say a treat for the brain is actually a treat that you may consider is actually not a treat for the brain. Just to drive that point home. So I think it's about knowing what's in your environment, changing that up, and really looking at the whole healthy foods that you can bring into your diet, into your daily nutrition plan. But also, what I like to do with people is ask them one habit that they're willing to change, and start there. Because I've learned that you can't provide people with a list and a ton of things that they need to do. It's just break it down, simplify it, and what is one simple habit that you can change and are willing to do. And we'll work from there through the nutritional psychiatry evaluation, a food plan, the what is going on with their microbiome, because the gut-brain axis is so important. But it's also environment. If you have a cupboard in your kitchen from COVID that's full of cookies or things that are highly processed and that type of stuff, everyone has that. But if that's what you're relying on for most of your daily nutrition, then obviously something needs to be adapted from there. And every plan now is so highly personalized. So part of it is working with someone on what really works for them, plus what they feel autonomously they want to change. So
great response. And I was going to actually bring up the biome. So I read about the how our guts have actually shrunk considerably in the last 2 million years. And a lot of biologists and anthropologists believe that's because, one, we started eating meat, which doesn't require constant chewing like raw vegetables.
Right.
And two, we started cooking food. We harnessed fire shortly thereafter, and cooked food goes down easier. So I wanted to get your opinion on, one, the biome, and two, this idea of raw versus cooked food. There's both camps are very ardent about their stance, and I tend to think it's a little bit of both is probably the healthiest, because you release nutrients with cooked food, right? Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So I'm with you on that. I think that, there are, with food and with diet, but, we tend to in this country be very much in camps about different things. And I find that the more I understand about the gut microbiome and the research which is emerging, it's really what is the path for you as an individual that works. Personally, I think, as I'm preparing my vegetables, I always munch on some of the raw veggies or keep some crudité or something in my salads, and then I cook the rest as well. So it's about having that balance. Yes, you get the positive effect of the microbiome from that carrot and everything else when you munch on it or crunch in it, but there's not necessarily that you're losing everything by cooking it. In fact, with some foods like steaming spinach actually helps with lowering the oxalate levels, so it's knowing those nuances. If you actually boil sweet potatoes before roasting them, you lower the glycemic index. So there's also lots of nuances within foods, and I think that is why, if you're eating a complete composed plate of food, that is, I do believe then that vegetables bring back that fiber that we need. So that with whether you're omnivore or you're plant-based, whatever diet it is that you're eating, make sure you have some of those good foundational foods on your plate, including the omega-3s. And the plant-based omega-3s are not as well absorbed, but they are still sources. And you can take an algal oil supplement if you don't eat seafood. And I'm one of those people. So you have to find these other ways to bring them into your diet. It won't be as effective as the piece of salmon, but you can still do that, and there are ways, in fact, to tweak the absorption as well.
I feel like I need to have dinner at your house.
I think we might have to arrange that. So.
I'm excited to experience your culinary talents. Maybe we should
share that.
before we close up. I'd like to talk about COVID, obviously. The elephant in the room. You write a lot about brain fog in your book, and I feel like there's a relationship there, and this idea of languishing that's been written about recently, where people aren't necessarily depressed due to the isolation and the quarantine, but they're in kind of a funk, and curious what you've witnessed in your patients and how you talk to them about that.
I've seen a lot of that, and a lot of them actually, that's often a really good niche for working in nutritional, really changes, nutritional psychiatry plans, including foods that help really subtly and slowly help with your mood and your anxiety, because they sort of not quite at the level of needing an antidepressant, but just almost have this blue feeling with lack of energy, sort of brain fog. and not feeling good, but getting to work, even if it's on Zoom. And I think that that's where just building in some nutritional psychiatry pillars, as I talk about, becomes important. Whether it's the color of the rainbow because of the plant polyphenols and all of the nutrients you get from there, whether it's the omega-3s, whether it's spices, one of my favorites, whether it's sort of, I have a mood boosting chai latte because I think that just having soothing, comforting foods that have good nutrients in them, that to me, that's a comfort food. And that, leafy greens, another one that people kind of ignore. They have immense amounts of folate in them. And folate, low folate's associated with the feeling of depression. And I think that languishing is somewhere in my clinical experience between not being depressed, but just not having the robust energy that you might be used to having. And I think that COVID has done a number on many of us. So food is just a very easy way that we can start to work on that along with everything else.
And I'm curious, you write about very specific conditions in your book: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, ADHD, or PTSD. When you have a patient, suffering from one of these illnesses, do you attempt, you touched on this earlier, but attempt to cater the diet based on the research?
Yes.
Eventually?
That's exactly it. Yeah. And because one of the things I find, for example, with individuals with OCD, they really need to understand the list of foods to be careful with. That might help lower their symptoms, because they're often they may be even eating healthy, but not realize what foods may contain certain nutrients that work against OCD. And that's where the research comes in. That's, with things like stress and anxiety, as well as insomnia. Again, it's the sleep hygiene. It's what are you eating the rest of the day? It's not just, can I eat something at night to help me sleep? It's also what you do in the time before that. So, I think that it is a much more of an individual plan for everyone, but it gets into specifics based on the condition. And then also, Bret, in psychiatry and mental health, we deal with DSM, the DSM classification. Many people fall between the gaps, right? They don't have just one. So it's really about finding the symptoms that someone has and then addressing that through food and nutrients.
That's great. And somewhat related, I began realizing as I published or was writing my book, just how the very interventions we use today to prevent cognitive decline and to preserve our brains are the same influences that really drove our brain evolution. So being social primates, being creative and challenging our brain, and then certainly this varied diet, this omnivorous diet was so important.
Well, speaking to that research in your book, I think that's another thing that really, and let me just show everyone. And you said this is a brain scan, right? That was
it's a brain scan, yeah.
Photoshop, beautiful. Because social isolation has really come through in COVID, and I know we're all exhausted about talking about COVID, but it's one of the things that has really impacted people because we're social creatures by nature, right? So it's just something that I think evolutionarily we sort of, certainly through your book, have understood the history. So thank you for writing it. I think it's a really cool book. I think it's a really cool book.
I appreciate it. Well, as is yours, and I will show it again. This is your brain on food, and maybe we could close out.
Yeah.
It's our book club.
Awesome.
Well, we'll do it again,
awesome.
But could you close it again? Yeah. Could you just close out with, what do you want the Medscape audience and practicing clinicians out there, whether they're psychiatrists or family medicine doctors, what do you want them to really appreciate about nutritional psychiatry?
I think what I want them to appreciate is that the power of teaching someone, teaching a patient, teaching yourself, teaching your family, just some healthy food habits is not only just powerful, it's at the end of your fork, right? It's something that any one of us can do. And I think that even asking, if you could just include that in the questions you're asking. I know time is limited when you're talking to your patient, but just ask them about diet and lifestyle because it is such a critical part of so many conditions, including our metabolic health these days. So just if you could throw in that question there just for me, I would love that.
Final question. Can you pick a favorite recipe out of your book?
Oh my God, that's probably my lentil, my dal, the spinach dal, which is the lentil. It can be a soup, in winter. It can be part of an Indian meal. It can just be a great nutritional sort of plant-based sauce with spinach and lentils and lots of fiber and lots of spices. It's one of my favorites. It's sort of my go-to. And then if you eat chicken, if you eat steak, whatever it is, you can actually saute those and add them in, by the way, to make it a very hearty stew, which we actually do in parts of northern India for a version of that.
I love dal. I'll make it this weekend.
Excellent.
All right, Dr. Naidoo, thank you so much.
Send me a picture. It's great to see you, Bret. Thanks for hosting this.
It's not going to look pretty, but I will. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thanks, Uma. We'll talk soon.
Take care.
All right.
See you. Bye-bye.